Imagine running for your life and knowing no one can hear you. The world becomes a place of visual alarms, heel scrape on wet pavement, a scarf's flutter, the flash of a street lamp on damp leaves. None of it a bell to rally help. For Mallerie Sinclair, those details were all she had that evening. The austerity of autumn light, the smell of rain in the gutters, the metallic note of her own breath as she pushed the door of Brennan's corner cafe and nearly collided with a wooden chair. Her hands were trembling. Not the polite, quiet tremble of nerves that a stranger might mistake for cold, but a raw, urgent shiver that translated into jerky, bright gestures, frantic shapes against the warm amber inside the shop. She blurted signs, fingers scattering like birds. Her face was gaunt with panic. Her eyes darted to the glass behind her. He was only a few steps away. He wore a gray hoodie, soaked to the shoulders, and he moved like someone who believed distance was the same as permission. The cafe had been half empty, two students hunched over laptops, a couple arguing in muffled voices at the corner table, a barista wiping down the counter with the neat mechanical motions of someone finishing a shift. The noise was ordinary, a low radio playing a late afternoon song, the hiss of the espresso machine, little conversations that felt safe because they had always been safe before. For a few of the patrons, Mallory's hands were just theater. For others, they were an oddity. No one reached for a phone. No one tipped a face toward the pulsing fear in her expression and understood that those gestures were not decorative. They were a plea. He padded inside 2 steps behind her, close enough to count her pulse without being seen as dangerously close. Each step made her stomach flip. She tried to speak. The words came out as breath and fragments, swallowed by the cafe's din. She clawed at the air for a way to say, "He's following me, he won't leave me." Instead, her hands made the sentence their own, sharp angles meant to break through the misunderstanding around her. Her sign landed, raw and plain. She watched faces misread it as a quirk. Someone laughed at a private memory. Someone else shifted at their phone. At the window, near the warmly lit corner where the light pooled like tea, sat Wyatt. He had a mug in both hands, and his daughter, Julie, was on his lap, knees bunched, a small hand wrapped around his finger. The girl's jacket was still speckled with rain, her hair curled at the nape of her neck. She was the neat center of his life. Wyatt's wrist bore the faint, faded scar from a bicycle fall years ago, an object lesson in minor catastrophes turned manageable. The scar was insignificant, perhaps, but it matched the rest of him. Practical, quietly protective, the kind of man who thought in checklists and bedtime stories. People called him a single dad at times when they wanted to be kind about his solitude. Amelia's small photo hovered on a shelf in his apartment, and sometimes Wyatt would smile at the silence where her laughter used to be. Sometimes he would whisper directions to Julie about tying a shoelace, as if the voice could patch absence. He knew how to steady a child through scraped knees and how to hold space for silence. He also knew, with a certainty that surprised even himself, how to read hands. When Mallory's frantic signing reached his table, Wyatt's first motion was not a ripple of curiosity. He watched the shapes move across the air like a small storm. He recognized the language with that peculiar intimacy you only develop by practicing it in real life. The arc of an index finger that asked for someone to stop. The flat palm that meant don't. The sudden double hand gesture that stacked meanings into an emergency. There was an economy to her motion that spoke louder than her face. He had been fluent for years, less for show than necessity, in the private grammar of a family that learned to make itself whole again after loss. Without thinking, without drama, he signed back. His hands were steady. They cut the air with the economy of someone used to translating fear into direction. When he signed, the room changed. Not with sound, but with attention. Julie's small hand tightened on his finger. A barista paused mid-polish. 2 heads turned. Mallory had been summoning help into the wrong language until Wyatt supplied one the cafe could understand. He made eye contact with her, and his expression promised a single thing. "I see you." Then he signed again, slower, precise, to give the same message to those watching. He's not leaving her alone. The words landed like a pulse. The barista, Stephanie, 26, hair in a loose bun, face worn to a kindness, stood frozen for a half-second, then hurried to the counter. Wyatt's actions were not loud. They were surgical. He rose from his seat and positioned Julie against the table where the little girl's back faced the door. He cupped the child's shoulders with his forearm so she would be shielded, small and safe behind him. He placed himself between Mallerie and the man in the hoodie, as if the geometry between bodies could be a beacon of protection. He signed to Mallerie again, a few quick, clarifying gestures. Then he spoke, not shouting, but with a firmness that had the force of command. "Stephanie, call the police." The barista moved. Her hands fumbled for the phone on the hook behind her. When she spoke into it, her voice was the trembling, human thing that answered the moment. "There's someone in my cafe. Yes, a man. Please come." She watched the gray hoodied figure with the same quick assessment that every person makes when hurtling through an ordinary evening. Can this be contained, or will it expand? Her mouth formed apologies to Mallerie without sound. Her eyes filled as she tried to understand hands she did not know. The man who had followed Mallerie stood at the counter now, polite with the practiced politeness of someone who expected to be believed. He smiled once, a small flash of white that did not reach his eyes. He folded his hands as if to say, "I am merely a concerned citizen," a lie of the posture. Wyatt did not wait for the lie to be exposed. He signed a single emphatic gesture to Mallerie. "Stop. Stay." He then turned and, with deliberate visibility, positioned his body so that the stranger would have to pass him to reach Mallerie. It was an elementary maneuver, but it was perfect. It converted the cafe into a defensive formation. It made everyone in the room aware that they were on notice. A few patrons moved. A teenage barista wiped her hands with the corner of her apron and stared, suddenly ashamed for having treated the gestures as spectacle. A student pushed his laptop closed, slower than Wyatt would have liked, but then moved too. The couple in the corner stopped their argument and watched. A few faces registered the peculiar, scandalous fact that someone in public, not a policeman, not a hero on a movie screen, knew sign language and was using it not for performance, but as a public shield. Wyatt's signing had an edge to it now, a business-like rhythm you hear in people who do not confuse kindness with softness. He asked the barista for the man's plate number, a manner of speech that in practice meant, "Give me a description." He keyed an explicit set of signs toward the man to calm himself, and then, more urgently, sign language commands that might be spoken in a different setting. "Stay put. Don't touch. Wait." He spoke aloud where the voice mattered. He told Stephanie to keep the front doors clear. He called out to Julie and signed to the little girl in a shape that meant, "Watch me, sit down." And Julie obeyed, a small adult in miniature, trusting her father's hand the way a boat trusts an anchor. Mallerie's chest heaved. Her fingers found refuge in a slow, controlled sign. "Thank you," then back to the rage and fear that would not be smoothed by politeness. She watched Wyatt as if studying the shape of safety. To her, his decisive manner was not only rescue but recognition. Someone had seen the language of her hands and answered in it. That, perhaps, was as crucial as pulling the person away. In a world built for ears, to be read was to be understood. To be understood was to be made human. Then Gregory Dalton spoke. His words were honeyed, measured, the kind of sentences that sound like concern to people unprepared for menace. "Is everything all right?" he asked, voice low enough to be conspiratorial. Wyatt did not answer with rhetoric. He signed aloud to Mallerie, the cadence of his hands fastest now. He translated, not because any politeness required it, but because the presence of other people demanded clarity. He told Mallerie what the man was saying. He told the man what he had signed. "We called the police." He seated himself with a deliberate calm that swallowed the immediate urge to be violent. The shock that crossed strangers' faces was not at a hand hitting a jaw, but at the quiet efficiency of Wyatt's method. He did not need to scream. He used the space between bodies and the grammar of hands to make an incontrovertible fact. Someone was in control, and that someone had made safety public. Outside, the streetlight seemed to flicker as if on cue. The rain had eased into a steady mist. In the windows, the city's autumn looked like watercolors, blurry taxis, smeared light, the silhouette of a man moving with intention. The cafe's door remained open. a thin line of night pouring into a small world of coffee steam and the smell of sugar. No one could tell, with absolute certainty, what the stalker might do next. That had been the point of him entering in the first place, to create uncertainty and use it as leverage. The ordinary cruelty of stalking is the slow erosion of safety. The ordinary terror is that no alarm is loud enough. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. A patrol car's blue light cut down the strip of road. It would take time to arrive. Wyatt kept his body where it was. He kept his hands moving. Signs are like small verbs that want to work between people, and he gave them work to do. He asked Mallerie where she lived, a question he spoke aloud and signed again. She flinched, refuted the sign with a shake of her head. She could not give the address. She dug at the inside of her coat as if clutching a small compass that would point toward safety. He signed back. "We will get you somewhere safe." He told Stephanie to leave the doors open. People must be able to come and go in case help arrives. He made everyone breathe differently, more careful, more alert. When the patrol car pulled up, 2 officers in dark uniforms stepped from the vehicle with the calm vigor of trained responders. They crossed the pavement and took in the scene with efficient eyes. One of them asked the man his name. Wyatt translated back and forth with an uncomplicated precision, handing the officers the grammar of the moment that made sense to Mallerie. He summarized what had happened without flourishes. Woman ran in, man followed. He watched the way Gregory's shoulders tightened as identification was requested. Gregory gave a name, then another. Names are strategies for the selfish. They can be pawned, traded, abandoned. The officers asked for identification. One of them eased a hand into his pocket for the cuffs. The other took out a small camera and began to document the scene as required by procedure. The arrest was not dramatic. There was no scuffle, no cinematic tackle. The officers spoke calmly. One read a short statement in the kind of plain language that law requires. "You are under arrest on suspicion of stalking and harassment." As they moved to place Gregory in the back seat of the patrol car, his face shifted through a dozen masks. Rage, shame, indignation, false apologetics, each one failing to catch his escape. He kept insisting he meant no harm. Wyatt translated again and again. He kept translating not to shame the man, but to keep Mallerie tethered to the facts, to language that could orient her in the rapid choreography of police, paperwork, and physical removal. There were apologies then, the kind that come late and sound small. A student muttered, her cheeks hot, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." The barista, Stephanie, pressed a paper cup of warm tea into Mallerie's hands like an offering. Her fingers were damp with compassion. Mallerie rocked it against her palm, a talisman against shock. She laughed once, not an honest laugh but a sound of disbelief, and then slipped into a shuddering breath. She thanked Wyatt with a gesture that was both an apology and gratitude. Wyatt only shrugged in the way of people who have lived enough to know that gratitude is complicated. "You're safe now," he signed, and said aloud so others could hear. "We're going to make sure you're safe." After the officers had taken statements and written down descriptions, after the man in the gray hoodie had been placed in a patrol vehicle and driven away with the rattle of metal doors and the click of a radio, a kind of exhausted silence settled over Brennan's corner. Mallerie's tremor had slowed. The edges of panic were still raw, but they no longer vibrated with immediate threat. She kept her hands folded in her lap like someone holding lit matches. Around her, people unpicked the small threads of their earlier indifference and tried to stitch something better. The students whispered, the couple offered tissues. A child near the counter stared at the scene with the fascination of innocence watching adults make meaning of danger. Wyatt sat down opposite Mallerie. He set a napkin on the table and folded his hands, palms up, a universal signal of peace. His daughter, Julie, leaned her head against his arm and watched the exchange like a small witness. In that quiet, a new scene settled in. The aftermath of rescue, which is never immediate unalloyed relief, but something more gnarled. Relief wrapped around embarrassment, gratitude laced with residual terror, a cautious curiosity about what would come next. Stephanie brought over a legal pad where she had written down details. "Do you want me to call anyone?" she asked, voice small again but practical. People always lean toward practical after fear. Mallory's fingers moved in a hesitant, delicate sign. No. She did not want to call family, not immediately. It was not that she had no one. It was that the consequences of being seen might ripple in ways she had not been ready to share. Here, within the pool of cafe light, she found a shape that felt provisional. Safe. Not permanent. Wyatt pushed his phone across to her. He didn't ask for her number in the formal way of an exchange that might turn to romance. He offered it as a tool. A lifeline slipped into her palm. The gesture was practical as a bandage. He said aloud, softly, "If you need anything, call me, or come here Saturdays. This is Brennan's. I sit by the window." He signed the same sentiment, slower, his hands deliberate because he understood how language sometimes had to be held for someone to catch it. There was no insistence in him, only an offer, a place to return to if she wanted it. She looked at the phone as if it were a foreign object, then at Wyatt's face, searching for any second motive. He taught her how to sign his name. It was a small, private ritual. 2 fingers traced a shape near the chest that spelled his identity. She tried, clumsy at first. She laughed under her breath, a small, wet sound. "Julie," Wyatt signed, and the little girl furrowed her brow to watch, then copied the pattern with a tiny finger like a pupil learning her first letters. That small scene, father teaching daughter to fold 2 fingers in the shape of someone's name across an afternoon of quiet recovery, felt like the beginning of something. It felt like repair. Outside, a patrol car idled with paper crisp in the officer's lap. Gregory Dalton sat in the back with his hands cuffed and his mouth set in a line of thin pride. He carried dignity the way a gambler carries a hand of worthless cards, with a stubborn belief that the next play would redeem it. But the next play did not come that night. The city moved on. An officer opened the car door and walked back towards the cafe, clipboard in hand, ready for the mundane diligence that accompanies a heroic-sounding moment: the name, the date, the time, the description. The officers were polite to everyone, professional, and not theatrical. They handled the paperwork and urged people to keep calm, to consider taking photographs for evidence, to be ready to give statements at the station. They told Mallory that they would make an incident report, and, if necessary, help her obtain a protective order. "We'll walk you through it," one officer said. The words were simple and procedural, but they meant something substantial in the faint architecture of Mallory's relief. For a long while after, Mallory stayed at the table, hands tucked into her sleeves, staring at a patch of light on the tabletop. Her fingers made small, idiosyncratic signs that had nothing to do with the urgency of the night. Habitual motions that anchor a person in normalcy. Stephanie kept the coffee coming, refilling a cup without words. Patrons made small offers: a ride home, an extra scarf. Wyatt listened to each and translated where language was needed. Not condescending, but with a steady clarity that let Mallory decide which fabrics of help she wanted to accept. When she finally rose to leave, it was as if the evening had forced her to choose whether she wanted to be invisible or to step into the world that had nearly betrayed her. She shouldered her bag as if lifting a future. Wyatt took the step with her to the door, Julie at his side like a small, bright presence. Outside, the mist had thickened. The city sidewalk gleamed with 100 tiny mirrors. They stood there for a moment, neither saying much. In the small silence before departure, Wyatt signed one more thing: "If anything changes, you come straight here." He pointed gently toward the cafe, the light beacon he had created by being visible. He asked, with the simplicity of men who have seen danger and chosen not to ignore it, if she would come back on Saturday. He didn't frame it as a date. He offered it as a recurring harbor. She hesitated, then nodded. The nod was tiny but deliberate. It was a contract. As she walked away into the wet night, shoulders folding inward against the cold, a handful of things had happened that had not been planned. A man had used language to turn a public place into a temporary sanctuary. A child had watched learning the contours of words made by hands. A barista had acted on her own authority and called the police. A man who had been following someone had been put into handcuffs and led away by officers whose job was the mundane ritual of safety. Most of all, the ordinary people in the room had been moved from spectators into a kind of complicity. They had been taught, by quiet force, that watching could be transformed into action. That small transformation was the shape of the evening's miracle. Wyatt closed the door with a gentle click and sat back down. Julie climbed into his lap again as if nothing in the night could unmake the domestic quiet they carried in their bones. The little girl's fingers found Wyatt's hand, and for a moment he looked like someone who had been holding his breath without knowing it. He exhaled. He ran a thumb along Julie's knuckle and watched the tiny lines of her palm as if they could tell him what to do next. His actions that night had been decisive but not theatrical. They were modest instruments of a mind that calculates risk and then moves. In the back of his mind, Wyatt had a thicket of other things: bills, bedtimes, reminders of Amelia, and now a new entry. A woman with hands that shook and a name to remember. He had given her his number. He had asked her to come back on Saturday. It was a small routine gesture that suggested more than it promised. He did not know what it meant yet for his life. He only knew this: the alley network of his days had widened. A new street had opened up. He felt an odd flutter of curiosity mixed with an old, long-forgotten warmth. Julie watched the door once more as if it were a stage. "Daddy," she signed suddenly, an impulsive, bright attempt at the new language her father had been using that night. The sign came out jagged and wide, a child's approximation of a soundless world. Wyatt smiled and corrected her hand with a gentle repositioning. "Good," he mouthed, and then signed back to reinforce the shape. Julie's face lit up. Learning happens in small gratifications. It is a slow, steady building of trust from finger to finger. Across town in a sterile station office, Gregory Dalton answered questions with a belligerence mellowed into a practiced remorse. He insisted he had not meant to harm anyone. He asked if being accused meant that his life was over. Men like that are often built from a mixture of entitlement and confusion. They are adept at manufacturing narratives where their persistence is love. The officers logged his answers, took his prints, and made a recommendation for a temporary restraining order to be drafted if Mallerie wished it. Legal language is a blunt tool for healing, but it is sometimes the only available mechanism to create space. Back in the cafe, as the late-night crowd thinned and chairs were stacked, Wyatt helped Stephanie wipe the final ring marks off the table. He ran his hand along the wood like someone turning the pages of a book. They were all tired in useful ways, the kind of tired that comes from adrenaline spent and humanity exercised. Stephanie offered him a small half-smile. "You did good," she said. "You saved her tonight." She did not frame him as a saint. She named the practical fact. His knowledge did good physical work in the world. He felt awkward at the praise. Saving a person is seldom something a normal man thinks he deserves compliments for. It is at best something you do because you must. Still, as the cafe lights dimmed to the amber of closing time, Wyatt felt a shift inside him that was not entirely explainable. The night's calculus had handed him a sudden sense of being necessary, in a way that had nothing to do with bills or bedtime songs. There was a small sweetness to being the one who could translate danger into safety. Mallerie walked home under the city's wet lamplight with hands still hot from signing. She had the phone number in her head like an anchor, Wyatt's name shaped in memory. The night's fear still flicked behind her ribs, but so did an odd, cautious relief. The world had not been entirely indifferent. A man had read her language and spoken back. That simple reciprocity was the thing that would unfurl days later into ritual, and then into something that looked like family. For now, it lay in the phone number, the Saturday invitation, and the soft, luminous memory of hands that had steadied her. As the cafe sign blinked off and the chairs stacked into little soldier lines, a new strand began to thread through the lives inside. The idea that stranger and stranger could be less separate than they had been. An ordinary night had moved things into a modest rearrangement. It had replaced a hollow, fear-shaped space with the possibility of company. It had produced, from a handful of gestures, a barista's quick call, a father's steady hands, and the calm work of officers, something that resembled a first public promise. "We will be here." If this story moves you, consider subscribing to hear more moments where ordinary people choose to act. The mist gathered on the window as Wyatt and Julie finished their hot chocolate. He signed a small thing to his daughter, a shape that meant stay close, and she complied. Outside, the city continued to pulse with indifferent life. Inside the cafe, the evening's light receded but did not vanish. It left a warm pool at the corner table by the window, the exact place where an act done in silence had made a difference. The table bore the faint ring marks of an interrupted cup of coffee, a small physical trace that would, in time, become memory. For now it was a mark on wood, a quiet emblem of the night when a deaf woman's pleading hands had finally found an answer. They did not know as they washed dishes and tallied the receipt book and made sure the chairs were all tucked in, that this was the first Saturday that would slowly, inevitably, become a ritual. They did not know the small, private decisions that would ripple forward. A child deciding to learn a new way to talk, a woman deciding that a certain room would be safe again, a father deciding that language was worth learning because it could keep people alive. They only had the now. Wet coats, the smell of coffee, the low hum of a city at close to midnight, and the knowledge that they had acted. It was enough for one breath. It might be enough for more. The Saturdays came like small, deliberate reopenings. Brennan's corner filled in slow increments, old men with paper cups, a woman with paint-stained fingers, a mother who queued for the single table by the window because she liked the light. Mallerie began to arrive at mid-afternoon. A careful ritual. A coat buttoned up differently some days against the wind, a scarf looped like a talisman, the phone number in her pocket as a quiet, mechanical comfort. Wyatt was always there. Julie was always there. Sometimes Stephanie had a shift. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes Uncle Micah dropped in on his way from the hardware store with a joke and a cautious, practical gift. Extra keys, a flashlight with fresh batteries. Wyatt's mother came twice, bringing scones and a way of making tea that smelled like consolation. At first, their Saturdays were functional, safety wrapped in routine. Wyatt sat at the window, Mallerie at the table opposite. For a while, they spoke sparingly. Where spoken language failed or felt unnecessary, their hands filled the space between them. Their signing was patient at first, halting in its own domestic way. Wyatt teaching, Mallerie correcting, Julie imitating with the concentration of someone building a tower. The gestures looked at times like music notated in the air, a pulsing visual notation of trust. They kept the practical matters in order. After the cafe incident, the officer who'd taken the report called to check in a week later, then again when the restraining order had been filed. The process was bureaucratic and slow in that merciless way bureaucracy can be. Forms filled, copies stamped, a small file that represented a promise more than anything else. The restraining order was temporary at first, an immediate legal boundary drawn by ink and paper. It read like a blunt instrument on a page, but for Mallerie it functioned as a line she could point to when the world wanted to argue. Gregory Dalton received the notice. The court clerk typed the terms, the judge affixed a faint signature, and Mallerie walked out with a document that could be taken to police if needed. The officers promised that they would respond quickly if the order was breached. They meant it as best as law can mean anything human. The months that followed were a slow curriculum of ordinary bravery. Wyatt visited the station with Mallerie to offer statements and to sign affidavits. He sat with her while she described what had happened, translating the gestures into a kind of official language that the forms required. The officers who had been there the night of the arrest remembered the coffee ring table, the small domestic geometry that had kept a woman out of harm's reach. They remembered a little girl learning names with a clumsy finger. To them, too, the case had been a neat human thing. Someone had intervened in time. The files got their place in drawers. The echo of the night settled into something manageable. Meanwhile, the Saturdays softened into something else. Mallerie taught Julie a sign for apple that involved the thumb tracing the cheek in the child's version, less a precise lexeme than a charm. Julie learned quickly, dragged by the joy of novelty. She learned the shape of Wyatt's name and the sign for stop, and the exaggerated theatrical sign for silly that she used to mock her father in private. Mallerie taught small phrases: slow down, look here, good night. She taught Julie pragmatic things too: how to get someone's attention without tapping their shoulder, how to flash a light to signal in the dark, the funny, important technique of catching someone's eye before signing something private across a crowded room. These were lessons of respect and caution, not pity. Each little victory was a softening of fear into competence. Julie rewarded Mallerie with art: crayon pictures of 3 stick figures holding hands, captions in a child's block print: Daddy, Julie, Mallerie, often with a heart they always insisted on coloring outside the lines. The girl's early attempts at grammar were earnest and hilariously wrong. She signed eat when she meant cat, then corrected herself with a sheepish grin. Mallerie would laugh, the sound quick, bright, and oddly adult in its relief. Wyatt would watch them both and feel a warmth that made his hands tremble in a good way, the same tremble that had once been exclusive to fear. The cafe itself changed. Stephanie kept a small stack of laminated cards near the espresso machine. Basic signs written in block letters under simple illustrations: hello, stop, help, thank you. She made them after the night of the arrest and tacked a handful at the counter. People use them sometimes, fumbling through the shapes like children discovering a new instrument. The students who had been on laptops the first night began to nod when seeing Mallerie, their eyes catching in recognition rather than novelty. The couple who had argued in the corner asked politely once, in their curious spoken language, whether they could sit closer to the window to practice signs with Mallerie. In small, everyday ways, the cafe learned to hold more than coffee. Outside the microcosm of Brennan's, life continued in its jagged arc. Wyatt returned to routines of bills and lunches packed and storytime rules. He attended PTA meetings that were quieter than they used to be. He drove Julie to playdates where a few of the other parents had come to understand that language need not be exclusively sound. Wyatt's mother, who had been careful with her praise the first time, warmed into an unabashed ally. She started bringing over photo albums annotated with sticky notes. Here's Wyatt at 5. He's stubborn even then. And, gently, asked how Mallerie was settling into Saturday life, as if it were the most natural thing for her son to have found a new companion. Not everyone's curiosity was kind. Once or twice, an old acquaintance of Wyatt's made a sideways joke about fixing what was different. Wyatt met those comments with his particular quiet firmness. He had no patience for lectures that mistook help for saviorhood. If anything, his nights with Mallerie taught him to be less certain in his certainties. He had been a man used to holding down the flank of his little family alone, but the new shape of his life required learning again how to be helped. The deeper turn in their lives came in a clinic with regulated lights and slow chairs. It was a conversation Wyatt had avoided, not because he thought it would change anything practical, but because words carry the weight of futures. The doctor spoke carefully about genes and probabilities, about what progressive meant in quiet clinical language. She used numbers, tempered adjectives. Wyatt listened. Julie sat with her hands folded in her lap, sometimes peeking over at Mallerie when a human face was needed. When Wyatt finally told Mallerie, he did it with the kind of small ritual that had become their language. He both signed and spoke, because some things needed to be both seen and said aloud. He said the words as if laying a map on the table. Tests had shown a mutation likely to cause a loss of hearing. Likely was the hinge. The doctor's timeline was not exact. It could be months. It could be a stretch into years. It was speculation pinned to probability, not prophecy. Wyatt watched Mallerie closely as he described the medical language, searching for any sign of recoil. Mallerie listened the way the sea listens to weather. Attentive, measured, a creature used to changes that arrive without permission. She had her own set of memories to offer and did so without melodrama. As a child, she'd noticed the world narrowing in strange increments, a muffled first, then longer pauses before a voice would register. She remembered the late nights of testing, of hearing aids that felt awkward on a developing skull, the way other children can be both cruel and oblivious. She told Wyatt about the first time she learned to lip read, and how she'd discovered sign language like a new continent you could step onto and live. "You know what's hardest?" She signed slowly, then traced the English aloud for Wyatt because she could, and wanted him to hear it too. Not the machines, not the silence itself. It's how people rearrange themselves around you, like you're a problem to be fixed. It takes time to meet someone as the person you are. Her hands moved gentle and economical, shaping a claim that was not complaint but fact. Wyatt heard it and felt his chest pocket with a tenderness that made him clumsy. He folded his hands and signed for a long time, matching the cadence of her narrative with gestures that were both translation and response. He told her that he loved what she had to teach, that if the future included hearing loss for Julie, it would not be new territory for at least one of them. He did not say, "I can fix it." He said with a steadiness that was remarkably honest, "We can learn it together." There was fear there too, a quiet, practical fear for a life shaped by medical uncertainty. They talked about hearing aids and visits to audiologists and the small, ingenious adaptations that people build into daily living. Blinking door alerts, vibrating watches, choice of seating at concerts, the way music could be felt rather than always heard. Mallerie spoke about her own coming-of-age moments with a wry humor. The first school concert she attended with a friend who stood on her right and pointed out the beats with foot taps. The first time she danced on a bus when a chorus thudded through the floor. She spoke about music as texture, not only as sound. Wyatt listened to all of it as if taking notes in the language of a man who wanted to be ready, instead of heroic. He asked practical questions. How to find a good audiologist, the best way to advocate at school, what support networks existed. He called a parent group that specialized in children with sensory differences, and sat on the phone until he felt he had mined enough information to be less panicked. Then he brought the knowledge back to Mallerie with the same economy of hand he used when signing. Small packages of utility, not spectacle. The intimacy between them grew without fireworks. It was a thing of ordinary domestic perfection. They cooked together in Wyatt's modest kitchen, Mallerie introducing him to a recipe from her childhood that involved a spice Wyatt had never heard of, and a trick with the oven that made Julie clap. They painted a small fence in the backyard of Wyatt's apartment complex, clumsy with brushes and the kind of quiet banter that builds a home. They argued the way people who intend to last do, about paint color and whether to keep curtains drawn at night, and then made up in whispers and signs. There were nights when Mallerie, newly confident in her place, would fall asleep on the couch and wake to find Wyatt tucking a blanket over her like a ritual. There were nights when Wyatt would stare at a photo of Amelia, and Mallerie would sign, in a gentle way that felt like blessing, a small thing of permission to love again. They did not rush public declarations. That was not their style. Love in their lives arrived as accumulation, a hand placed without announcement on a back while walking through the farmer's market, a text message that included a sign image Mallerie had sent to teach Julie a new word, Wyatt's mother setting aside 2 chairs at a family dinner because she had decided, moderately and finally, that Mallerie's presence was part of the furniture now. Each accumulation mattered because it was choice repeated. The turning point came on a day that was both ordinary and decisive. Wyatt had been late returning from work, held up by a meeting that lingered. Julie had already been tucked into bed. Mallerie had been at the counter doodling a small sunflower on a napkin. The 3 of them ended up in the tiny courtyard behind Wyatt's building, because someone had the idea to plant a small patch of sunflowers, Wyatt's mother's suggestion perhaps, or Uncle Micah's. Planting seeds at twilight is a curious domestic ceremony. The work is small, the rewards tentative, and the hands dirtied in a way that makes promises literal. Wyatt had for weeks been rehearsing a thing that was not a speech so much as a gathering of courage. He had learned to translate his nervousness into deliberate actions, arranging the flowers just so, remembering a line from the very first Saturday that had become a way he measured mornings. He had a small box in his pocket, which to him felt heavier because it contained a different kind of pact. He watched Mallerie as she adjusted a tiny plant into the earth, her fingers precise, the angle of her wrists telling him things no words could. Julie dug with a small plastic shovel, very content to be involved. Wyatt knelt beside them as if to tie a shoelace. He signed something ordinary, stay, And then, because it had become their method, he shifted the motion into a different grammar. He took the small box from his pocket and laid it in his palm. He did not make a speech. He let the sunlight and the smell of good soil and the sound of distant city traffic be the witnesses. He signed, slow and deliberate, some words that were reserved for the private places between them. "Will you be my family?" He said the same aloud for Julie and for the air, the phrase both a question and a promise. Mallory's hands moved in that pause, the fingers that had been steady through panic now stiff with possibility. Julie, who had been half buried in dirt and triumph, looked up with that immediate, unequivocal approval only a child could give. She signed before she knew why she was doing it. Yes. The motion was sharp, decisive, full of the particular authority that children carry when they are certain of joy. Mallory laughed, a sound that seemed to soften something in Wyatt's chest. She took the small box and opened it. Inside was a simple token, a ring perhaps, but small, practical, something that fit the tenor of their lives. She accepted it with an elegance that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with tacit understanding. She reached for Wyatt's hand and signed with slow, sure grammar, "Together." It was a murmured vow, private and public all at once. They did not announce an engagement. They did not need a label to function as the family they had decided to be. Instead, they adjusted matters gently. They began to plan weekend visits with Wyatt's mother as if the three of them were indeed a unit. They spoke with school administrators about inclusion, in a way that had the authority of two parents who had practiced patience. They arranged for Julie to have a baseline hearing test, and, when appropriate, follow-ups that were framed as medical routine rather than doomsday premonitions. Months folded into a year marked by small rites. Mallory introduced Julie to a piano lesson, where the teacher tapped rhythms on the tabletop so the girl could feel the music. They learned the joy of watching a child respond to the vibration beneath her feet. They attended community events where hearing aids and sign language booths were present. They joined a small support group that met once a month in a library basement and spoke of logistics and heartache and triumph. The group was practical and laconic, sometimes full of dry humor that could have been mistaken for gallows humor. It kept them real. Gregory Dalton's case dimmed into a note in the legal ledger. He could apply for modification, for appeal. He could shout apologies that never reached anyone's ears. The restraining order stood. When he violated it, as some people test clear boundaries to see whether consequences exist, the police responded with the same quiet efficiency as before. They issued citations and made it clear that the legal framework had teeth. They were not dramatic in their enforcement. They were procedural, which for Mallory meant that the world had mechanisms that would act even when fear wanted to whisper otherwise. There were nights where fear returned briefly, like a cold wind through a closed window, a shadow in a parking lot, a phone call that came in the small hours. Those moments were always shorter than before because there was a plan. There was Wyatt. There was Julie. There was a network that had grown, Stephanie's phone number, a neighbor who would check in, a small online group that recommended a good audiologist. There were practicalities, backup batteries for hearing aids, an arrangement at school to seat Julie in the front row when films were shown. Those were not glamorous victories, but they were victories nonetheless. The 1-year mark after the cafe night became something they noted with less ceremony than it deserved. It was less of an anniversary and more of a quiet regathering, a saturated domestic observance. They returned to the corner table at Brennan's because it felt right to do so. The table had a new set of ring marks and a faint scratch where a chipped cup had once been. The light pooled the way it had the first night. Julie arrived clutching a paper card she had made, the kind of earnest creation that made adults fold in on themselves with tenderness. This time, the cafe hummed like a living room. Stephanie had tacked another small sign near the counter. Saturday Family Table. It was painted in cheery letters. Uncle Micah was there, loud and fond. Wyatt's mother sat with an apron on her lap as if ready to bake at a moment's notice. The officers who had handled the case were not present. The paperwork was quiet in its own drawer. but the texture of safety lingered in the edges. Julie climbed into her chair and signed with sudden solemnity a short litany she had been practicing. Her hands were expressive and earnest in the way only children's hands can be. She signed, one after the other, words that meant, "Thank you," "Happy," "Love you." She punctuated the signs with an extravagant flourish that made the table laugh. Mallerie answered in kind, her hands fluent and sure. Wyatt watched them both and felt something inside him break open and mend in the same motion. They spoke about the year in small fragments. Wyatt mentioned the way his nights had changed. Fewer lonely stretches, more stories told aloud while falling asleep. Mallerie spoke about the work of learning to ask for help. Julie recited a list of signs she had mastered, each one accompanied by a story. Uncle Micah told a joke about the first time he had tried to sign banana and the absurd result. The laughter had an ease that belonged to people who trusted each other. Before they left, Julie slid a handmade card across the table. She had drawn 3 figures and a sun. In block letters she had written, with a child's confident spelling, "Family. Will you be my family?" The card was given with the gravity of a treaty. Wyatt and Mallerie both reached for it at the same time, fingers brushing. They read it and signed an answer that was more formal than necessary, the motion of hands forming a shared space. Yes. They kissed each other across the table, but gently, like two people who had learned the tender art of consent. Eyes locked, hands still speaking. Outside, the autumn light was kinder than the one that had first sent Mallerie into Brennan's. It had a memory of rain, but now it held warmth. The city moved on as it always does, but for the 3 of them the world had rearranged itself into a shape that fit. There was no final conquest of fear. There was no miraculous cure. There was, instead, the cumulative work of people choosing one another repeatedly. At the cafe door, Stephanie hugged Mallerie in a way that honored autonomy. Not clutching, not cloying, but solid and brief. "You did this," Stephanie mouthed, her smile steady. "You let us do it with you." The compliment landed the way all true compliments do, offering credit without claiming recompense. They walked home together under streetlights that were kinder this time. Julie skipped between them, a small comet of energy, her fingers tangled with both of theirs. When they reached Wyatt's stoop, she paused and signed, a small private message. "Thank you for keeping me safe." Her hands were earnest. The message was simple and enormous. Years would, if this story is to be believed, show quiet transformations that matter the most in the long ledger of ordinary lives. There would be medical appointments and small procedural anxieties about genetics and timelines that cannot be fully known. There would be more nights when fear brushed up against them. But there would also be first concerts attended with vibrating floor devices, school projects translated into sign and voice, bedtime stories that combined speech and signed motions as if the languages were complementary ornaments on a single tree. There would be holidays where seats were chosen for clear sightlines, and gatherings where music was felt instead of merely heard. On that one-year night, as they sat back down and their hands found one another over an empty cup, Wyatt signed to Mallerie the thing that could have been a speech if he had chosen words. "You made my family possible." He said it aloud too, but his signing was what counted, the steady vocabulary of someone who had learned how to build safety with both language and action. Mallarie's answer was not a set piece. She bent her fingers and traced his name across his chest, then drew a slow circle in the air that meant belonging. The 2 of them laughed, and the laugh was a physical thing that made Julie clap. The cafe hummed with a dozen stories, each unremarkable and essential. As they left Brennan's for the night, Wyatt closed the door carefully and lingered for a moment to look at the table where it had all started. He touched the faint ring mark with a thumb. It was a trivial habit and a sacred gesture at once, his hand registering the little scar left by an event that had changed the geometry of his life. There will always be moments that hurt to remember. There will always be nights when nerves thread tight, but sometimes when ordinary people choose to act, when a father signs across a room, when a barista picks up a phone, when a child learns to communicate in a new way, the ripple is such that it changes the course of other people's stories. Mallory's life was not saved by spectacle but by fluency. Linguistic fluency, ethical fluency, the willingness of others to be visible. Wyatt's action was not a dramatic single blow. It was a set of choices made in a public place that prioritized safety and dignity. The shocking thing in that headline is perhaps that such everyday courage can look ordinary until you see who it saves. If you've ever been helped by a stranger or found safety in an unexpected place, share that story in the comments. Your moments matter. And if this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need hope today.